They say July in Portbridge feels like a postcard, sunlight bleeding through pine trees, children playing near the marina, and the scent of wildflowers hanging in the air. But that summer, everything changed the morning Sierra Lanes stopped breathing. It was July 19, 2023. At 7:58 a.m., Matthew Vaughn called 911 from the couple's home in North Point, a quiet residential neighborhood on the outskirts of Portbridge, Oregon. His voice was calm, clinical, almost rehearsed. "My wife, she's unresponsive. She said she felt dizzy last night. I think it's food poisoning. Please hurry." When paramedics arrived 7 minutes later, Sierra was on the bathroom floor, pale, drenched in sweat, barely conscious. There was a faint pulse, but her body was rapidly shutting down. What stood out most to the EMTs wasn't the symptoms, but Matthew himself. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't even touching her. Instead, he stood near the door with his arms crossed, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, gray slacks, a wrinkled white shirt, and calmly reciting Sierra's medical background like a PowerPoint presentation. No known allergies. No family history. She's a surgical pharmacist at St. Emery. She had wine and a smoothie last night. Woke up vomiting this morning. Sierra was rushed to St. Emery Medical Center, one of Oregon's most respected hospitals. There, a team of ER doctors diagnosed her with severe gastrointestinal distress, likely foodborne. They treated her for dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, and potential bacterial toxins. But nothing helped. Within 24 hours, Sierra's condition declined drastically. Her organs began to fail. Her lungs filled with fluid. Her blood pressure crashed. Despite every intervention, doctors couldn't stabilize her. By day 2, she was intubated and placed in the ICU. By day 3, she slipped into a coma. And on day 4, she died. What happened next was even more unsettling than the death itself. Just an hour after Sierra was pronounced dead, Matthew called the hospital administration and made a clear request. "We'd like to forego the autopsy. Cremation should happen today, if possible." She expressed that wish to me last week. The speed of his request startled the staff. In standard practice, any sudden and unexplained death of a healthy individual under 40, especially one without clear diagnosis, is flagged for mandatory review by the state medical examiner. But Matthew, being both her husband and a licensed toxicology consultant, knew how to navigate those rules. He submitted the proper waiver forms. He referenced Sierra's DNR preferences. He even uploaded a PDF he claimed she'd signed the month before. That might have worked, if not for one unexpected email. Sierra's younger sister, Elena, received a message at 10:43 a.m. that same morning. It was from Sierra's private Gmail account, sent about 10 hours earlier, before she lost consciousness. "Hey, not sure if I'm just tired or if something's actually wrong. I had one of Matt's smoothies last night with a splash of wine. Not gonna lie, it tasted weird. I didn't finish it. But now I'm feeling awful. Just exhausted. I'll cancel the cabin plans this weekend. Don't worry. Love you." Elena didn't respond at first. She thought Sierra was just catching a stomach bug. But when the hospital called to inform her that her sister had passed, something didn't feel right. Why would a healthy 33-year-old woman, who ran 5 Burmese chots and avoided processed food, suddenly collapse after a smoothie? Why would her husband, an expert in pharmaceutical toxins, rush to burn her body without letting doctors run any final tests? The first real crack came from Sierra's best friend, Nina Chapman, a nurse practitioner who had visited the Lanes' home just 3 days earlier. She texted me to come over. Said Matt made her one of his weird protein smoothies and it tasted bitter. I tried a sip, it was awful. Like, chemical awful. I spat it out. Nina laughed it off at the time. So did Sierra. They joked about Matthew's mad scientist kitchen and how his idea of healthy often tasted like chalk and kale. But now, with Sierra dead, Nina couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. So she called the local police. And that was all it took. On July 24th, 5 days after Sierra's death, the Portbridge Medical Examiner's office issued a legal hold on her cremation. Her body, already scheduled to be transferred to the local crematory, was redirected to the state forensic lab in Salem. A toxicology screening was ordered. And behind closed doors, detectives began what would quietly become one of Oregon's most chilling homicide cases in recent memory. But at that moment, nobody, not even Elena, Nina, or their doctors, knew just how deep this story would go. They didn't know about the $750,000 life insurance policy Matthew had taken out 6 months earlier. They didn't know he had been secretly researching deadly dosages of a rare drug called colchicine, a substance with no smell, no taste, and no known antidote. And they certainly didn't know that in less than 2 days, Matthew would be updating his online dating profiles, describing himself as a widowed trauma survivor, looking for a gentle soul to rebuild with. But those truths were coming, and they wouldn't stay buried for long. Not in Portbridge. Not in a town where secrets have a way of seeping through the cracks, just like poison in a smoothie. They met like characters in a medical romance novel, 2 rising stars in white coats, drawn to each other between lectures and overnight shifts. Sierra Lanes was in her final year of pharmacy school when she met Matthew Vaughn, a toxicology resident known on campus for his charm and encyclopedic knowledge of poisons. Back then he was magnetic, not flamboyant or loud, but quietly charismatic. He carried himself with certainty, quoted obscure case studies from memory, and always seemed to know what to say to win trust. Sierra once told a friend, "He's like someone out of a noir film. You're not sure if you should admire him or fear him." At first, it was admiration. She was the eldest of 3 daughters from a modest family in Crescent Hill, Oregon. A straight-A student, a runner, a vegetarian, and a self-proclaimed science nerd with a soft spot for abandoned cats. Sierra had no room for distractions, but Matthew changed that. He listened when she talked about her mother's early-onset arthritis. He asked about her dreams to work in hospital trauma units, not retail chains. And when she was matched with a surgical pharmacy residency at St. Emery Medical Center, he asked to transfer his program to Portbridge to be closer to her. By 2020, they had moved in together. By 2021, they were married in a quiet ceremony overlooking the coast. On paper, they were perfect. But that was just the paper. The cracks didn't show immediately. Sierra kept busy. Her shifts were brutal, sometimes 12 hours straight inside operating rooms, preparing for drips, monitoring dosages, or advising surgeons on anesthesia interactions. Matthew, meanwhile, worked a hybrid schedule, part-time clinical consults, part-time remote work for the poison control hotline at the University of Pacifica. He often worked from home. Or so he said. It was in mid-2022 that Sierra's closest friends noticed something was off. She stopped bringing him up, Nina Chapman later told detectives. She used to talk about him constantly. His lectures, his toxicology cases, their weekend hikes. But suddenly, it was like he didn't exist in her stories anymore. Sierra had always been the kind of person who shared everything. So when she began withholding, her silence spoke volumes. Then came the odd expenses. At first, they were small, unknown restaurant bills, luxury rideshare charges during times Sierra thought Matthew was at home, subscription services she'd never seen before. She confronted him, gently. He brushed them off as work-related, or gifts for colleagues, or automatic renewals I forgot to cancel. She wanted to believe him. But then came the bigger ones, deposits to unknown Venmo usernames, weekend getaways labeled conference travel, and finally, a payment to an apartment rental company across town. That was the moment Sierra quietly reached out to her younger sister, Elena. "I think he's living a double life," she texted. "Like, actually has someone else. Not just an affair. Something darker. Something he's hiding." They had always maintained separate bank accounts, a decision they made when they got married, under the guise of financial independence. But now, that very separation became a veil for secrets. It was also around this time that Sierra discovered a printed bill stuck to the back of a shared printer tray, one she was refilling with paper. It was addressed to Matthew from a private lender, demanding payment on an overdue personal loan totaling over $38,000. That didn't include his student loans, which Sierra had assumed were under control. When she checked his credit report, using an old shared account they once used to rent their apartment, The total debt she uncovered was closer to $212,000. He's drowning, Elena told her. And you're his life raft. If you stay, he'll pull you under too. Sierra didn't answer right away. It wasn't just money. It was the distance, the lies, and something else, something harder to name. Matthew had changed. He no longer looked at her during dinner, no longer asked about her patients, or left her little notes like he used to during her night shifts. Instead, he disappeared for hours, even days, on the excuse of being on call. And when he was home, his mood shifted like weather fronts. Cold, then sweet, then aloof again. She once found lipstick on a dress shirt he'd left in the dryer. He said it was from a work party. She didn't argue. But she didn't forget. In May 2023, Sierra made a decision. She began documenting everything. Receipts, messages, even a voice memo after a particularly tense dinner where Matthew accused her of snooping and not trusting him. In that recording, which police later recovered, her voice trembles slightly as she says, "I don't know who he is anymore. I don't think I ever did. I think something about him scares me." And yet, despite all that, she wasn't ready to walk away. At least, not until July. 2 weeks before her death, Sierra confided in Nina again. "I've booked a lawyer. Quietly. I'm going to file for divorce after my next vacation block." The plan was to take a few days off, drive up to the coast, clear her head. She even messaged her ex-boyfriend, whom she'd remained close to as a friend, asking if he'd want to join for a short road trip, just to breathe a little. That trip never happened. Because the night before she was due to leave, Matthew offered to make her a smoothie. He'd never done that before. Not in years. He said it was a new recipe. She said it tasted off. He laughed and said, "You're just not used to healthy." She drank half of it. By morning, she couldn't stand. And so, beneath the surface of the perfect medical couple, there was rot, hidden in spreadsheets, apartment leases, and subtle bruises on trust. She had been planning to leave. Quietly, respectfully. But someone else had already planned for her exit. A permanent one. Sierra's final text wasn't poetic. There was no grand goodbye, no cryptic metaphor. Feeling awful. Canceling the trip. I think it was the smoothie. Couldn't sleep all night. She sent it at 6:42 a.m. on July 19th, hours before Matthew called 911. It went to 2 people, her sister Elena, and a contact in her phone saved only as AJ, someone detectives would later identify as Adrian James, a former classmate from pharmacy school and a close confidant Sierra had reconnected with months earlier. Adrian told police their relationship was deep but not romantic, though texts recovered from Sierra's encrypted folder hinted at a more emotional bond. "I'm not in love with him anymore. But he still sees me. I miss being seen." It was Adrian Sierra had been planning to road trip with the weekend she died. They were supposed to rent a cabin outside Seaside, Oregon. Watch old movies. Clear their heads. She'd even packed a duffel bag the night before, tucked by the front door, never touched again. Instead, she'd accepted a peace offering. A drink from a husband she no longer trusted. Matthew called it his reconciliation smoothie. "I know we've been off," he told her. "But maybe we could reset. Like we used to." He blended it in the Nutrimix, banana, berries, flaxseed, almond butter, and a splash of wine. She laughed when she saw the wine. "Seriously? You like wine," he said. "Not in a smoothie." Still, she took a sip. Then another. The texture was off. A strange bitterness curled at the back of her throat, not spoiled, but medicinal. "It's strong," she'd said. He shrugged. "Just vitamins. You're tired." She didn't finish it. She poured half down the drain. But by then, it was already enough. By morning, Sierra's symptoms matched classic early-stage colchicine toxicity. Nausea, vomiting, severe abdominal pain, sweating, muscle weakness. Matthew told paramedics she might have eaten something expired and that she'd been under a lot of stress. At the hospital, Sierra was disoriented but conscious. According to one nurse, her words were faint but deliberate. "I'll let him decide." It wasn't clear what she meant. At the time, They assumed she was confused. They didn't realize she was warning them. 3 days earlier, Sierra had seen her friend Nina Chapman, the same nurse who had once tasted a strange smoothie in Sierra's kitchen and spit it out immediately. This time, Sierra was alone. They met at Rainlight Cafe, a quiet place near the hospital. Nina remembers how tired she looked, not just physically but existentially drained. "He's distant," Sierra had said. "But when he does look at me, it's like I'm already a memory." She also mentioned something else. Matthew had started asking odd questions. Not about marriage or work or family, but about autopsies. He asked what happens if someone dies of a rare immune disorder, she'd said. Like, how quickly would it be caught? How conclusive are the tests? At the time, it seemed like medical curiosity. After all, he worked in toxicology. But now, in hindsight, those questions were anything but academic. At St. Emery's ICU, as Sierra's organs began to fail, Matthew suggested a diagnosis to the attending physicians. HLH, hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis. A rare and often fatal inflammatory condition that causes the immune system to attack its own tissues. Matthew described it in detail, citing articles, discussing symptoms, even suggesting treatment protocols. It impressed some of the staff. After all, who better to weigh in than a toxicology specialist who was also the patient's spouse? But behind the scenes, Sierra's test results told a different story. There were no signs of HLH. No suppressed cell counts. No inflammation markers. What they did see were elevated liver enzymes, acute kidney failure, lactic acidosis, lung fluid accumulation, all classic indicators of toxic exposure. Still, Matthew pushed his theory. He asked about expedited cremation again. He told Sierra's father over the phone that there's a 20% chance she'll survive, and we should start thinking about her wishes. That phone call was what finally broke the family's trust. He sounded like he was reading a weather report, Mr. Lanes later said. Not like a man losing his wife. When Elena arrived the next morning, Sierra was already in a coma. Tubes surrounded her, machines beeped steadily, and Matthew was gone. A nurse said he'd stepped out for coffee and some air. But in truth, he'd driven across town to a UPS drop box. Surveillance footage would later confirm it. Matthew deposited a package labeled Return RX Sample addressed to a P.O. box in Nebraska, a known redirect for overseas online pharmacy orders. Investigators would eventually learn what was inside, and used vials of injectable colchicine, sealed, never opened. He wasn't trying to get a refund. He was erasing the evidence. Sierra died at 7:41 p.m. on July 22nd. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Helen Cruz, based on Matthew's proposed theory, listed multi-organ failure due to HLH as the cause. No autopsy was scheduled. That might have been the end of it, had it not been for one persistent friend. Nina called the Portbridge Police Department that same night and filed a formal statement. She referenced the earlier Smoothie incident, the strange diagnosis, the rushed cremation. And most importantly, she handed over screenshots of Sierra's last texts, including the one about the taste. That alone was enough to place a cremation hold. The body had not yet been processed. It was rerouted, cold, silent, and intact, to the forensic lab in Salem. The question remained, was Sierra Lanes just a tragic case of medical mystery? Or had someone somewhere along the way turned knowledge into murder? When a healthy 33-year-old woman collapses in her own home after drinking a smoothie, people ask questions. When that woman dies 3 days later in one of the best hospitals in Oregon without a clear diagnosis, they demand answers. But when her husband, a toxicology expert, supplies the answer before the doctors can, that's when red flags begin to wave. Sierra Lanes was officially pronounced dead at 7:41 p.m., July 22nd, at St. Emery Medical Center. The cause of death listed on the preliminary death certificate? Hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis, or HLH, a rare, aggressive immune disorder that causes the body to attack its own organs. The man who insisted it was HLH? Dr. Matthew Vaughn, her husband, and conveniently, not an immunologist or pathologist, but a toxicologist. He wasn't just suggesting a possible cause. He was confident, detailed, and oddly rehearsed. He cited specific subtypes, quoted obscure medical journals, requested experimental treatment regimens usually reserved for advanced cases in children. It made sense on paper. The symptoms matched: high fever, low white blood cell count, multi-organ failure. But something didn't sit right with the ICU staff. No imaging, no labs, no bone marrow tests confirmed HLH. He was too sure, said Dr. Heather Mahoney, Sierra's primary ICU physician. As if he knew what we'd find or not find. And they didn't find anything. No genetic predisposition. No underlying autoimmune disease. No infection to trigger secondary HLH. What they did find, tucked away in Sierra's digital medical file, were manual entries logged in under Matthew's credentials. Dosage logs. Medication notes. Procedural suggestions. Entries that should not have existed because Matthew was not part of her official care team. And yet, 2 days before her death, he added himself into the hospital's EMR, electronic medical records, system, tagging himself under consulting staff. That gave him unlimited access. He could read every update, every test result. He could also, if he wanted, delete things. But there was a bigger problem. No one initially knew he had done it, because Matthew still worked part-time as a poison control consultant for the University of Pacifica's 24/7 toxicology line. He had institutional logins, clinical credentials, and a hospital-issued laptop synced to a VPN. Everything he did from that laptop? Automatically logged. So when Portbridge detectives obtained a preliminary digital warrant, what they found wasn't just suspicious, it was damning. On July 5th, 6th, and 10th, just weeks before Sierra's death, Matthew conducted multiple deep dive searches through the ToxNet database and PubMed research archives. His search terms? Colchicine lethal dose female 119 pounds. Colchicine poisoning symptoms timeline. Colchicine versus HLH clinical overlap. How to mimic HLH fatal signs. Injectable colchicine no prescription USA. He wasn't trying to treat anything. He was trying to fake something. Colchicine is a powerful anti-inflammatory drug typically used to treat gout. It's dangerous even in slightly elevated doses. The therapeutic window is narrow, 1.2 to 2.4 milligrams per day for an adult. But just 7 to 10 milligrams can cause catastrophic organ failure. And in Sierra's case? She weighed exactly 119 pounds. In one tab, Matthew had used a dosage calculator to estimate the minimum lethal amount based on her body weight. In another, he had messaged a pharmaceutical wholesaler overseas about a one-time purchase of injectable colchicine under his professional license. He placed the order using his hospital email. He paid for it using a burner card linked to an online payment service. And then, he deleted the thread. What he didn't know was that the hospital's laptop had background sync software that backed up system logs to a central server. Even deleted browser history left a digital shadow. While forensic investigators were still processing the device, something else surfaced. A UPS surveillance video, timestamped July 21st, the day before Sierra died. Matthew Vaughn, wearing dark jeans and a sweatshirt, deposited a small padded envelope in a prepaid return box near the Portbridge train station. Investigators obtained the box. Inside was a sealed container labeled Lab Sample Return Injectables. Inside that container were 2 unused vials of colchicine. He wasn't just buying poison. He was trying to return the leftovers. Back at St. Emery, Sierra's body was secured in cold storage following the cremation hold requested by the Portbridge Medical Examiner's Office. A new team, independent, unaffiliated, conducted a forensic toxicology screening using LC-MS/MS, liquid chromatography, mass spectrometry, capable of detecting trace-level toxins even post-mortem. What they found? Colchicine in fatal concentration levels. No prescription. No history of use. No reason for it to be in her system. This wasn't a misdiagnosis. This wasn't HLH. This was murder. But one final revelation chilled investigators even more. Matthew had called the funeral director on July 20th, 2 full days before Sierra died. In the call transcript, obtained later from subpoenaed records, he asked, "If someone passed suddenly from an immune collapse, what's the earliest a cremation could happen under state law?" He wasn't planning for death. He was scheduling it. Sierra had been gone for barely 4 days when neighbors noticed something strange. It started with a car. A silver Honda CR-V with out-of-state plates pulled into the lane's driveway just after 6 p.m. on July 26. A woman, tall, blonde, early 30s, stepped out, laughing into her phone. She had 2 suitcases. One of them had a luggage tag with a butterfly sticker and the initials, KR. The garage door opened automatically. She went inside. She never came back out. Over the next 2 days, she was seen unloading groceries, walking barefoot on the back deck, and even sunbathing in a striped lawn chair behind the fence. One neighbor thought it was Sierra's cousin, visiting to grieve. Another assumed it was a sister. But by day 3, the illusion shattered. "They were hugging," said Mr. Wendell, the retired postman who lived across the street. "Smiling. Holding hands." He kissed her forehead. He, of course, being Matthew Vaughn, the same man who just 1 week prior had posted a black and white photo of Sierra with the caption, "My angel. Taken too soon. I will never recover." But now he had company. And comfort. And what looked disturbingly like relief. It wasn't just the neighbors who noticed. One of Sierra's friends, Emily Torres, decided to stop by and drop off a card for Matthew. She hadn't seen him since the funeral. She knocked twice. No answer. As she turned to leave, the front door creaked open. The blonde woman stood there, wearing one of Sierra's robes. Emily froze. "Is Matthew home?" she asked. The woman smiled politely. "He's resting. Long week. Can I take a message?" Emily left in silence. She got in her car, drove half a block, then called Elena. "You need to talk to police. Something is very wrong." That call led to an informal tip, which led to a formal report, which led to a full-scale warrant. By July 29th, Portbridge detectives had what they needed, a signed order to search the Lanes' home for evidence related to Sierra's death. They arrived just after sunrise. Matthew wasn't there, but the woman was. She identified herself as Kendra Ross, a longtime friend of Matthew's who had come to support him. When asked how long she planned to stay, she said, "Indefinitely if he needs me." One detective glanced into the kitchen. On the fridge was a magnet with the words, "It's not a loss if it sets you free." Next to it, a Polaroid of Matthew and Kendra, taken at a restaurant. Timestamp July 24th, just 2 days after Sierra's funeral. During the search, police uncovered far more than photographs. In a drawer beneath the living room bar, tucked behind a pile of expired receipts, was a life insurance policy. Issued in January 2023. Insured, Sierra Lanes. Beneficiary, Matthew Vaughn. Amount, $750,000. The policy had no conditions related to cause of death, natural, accidental, or otherwise. It had been updated just 3 months prior with a clause that authorized expedited disbursement upon proof of cremation. There was also a checkbook entry showing a $450,000 deposit into a new account under Matthew's name, opened on July 27th. It wasn't just motive. It was a trail of intent. Meanwhile, Sierra's emails, recovered from her work-issued laptop, painted a clear emotional timeline. One draft, never sent, was titled, "When I Leave." In it she wrote, "I stayed because I believed in who you used to be. But I see now, you never stopped choosing yourself over the truth." She also detailed plans for divorce, scheduled to begin on July 25th. She had consulted a lawyer named Dana Holt, whose name was scribbled on a notepad found in her handbag. That meeting never happened, because Sierra died before she could attend it. And Matthew? He moved on as if it never existed. But perhaps the most chilling moment came during the search of Matthew's home office. Behind a stack of medical textbooks, officers found a burned DVD disc inside an unmarked envelope. They handed it off to the forensic team. It contained a slideshow one Matthew had played during Sierra's funeral service. Soft piano music, childhood photos, graduation shots. Their wedding day. Her smiling in hospital scrubs. And in the final frame. "You'll always be my one and only." He had cried when it played. The guests wept with him. And now, less than a week later, that same slideshow file was named public_funeral_final.mp4. Stored inside a folder called PR/sentiment/legacy. It wasn't mourning. It was branding. By the end of the week, police had enough to draw their own conclusion. Financial gain. A new relationship. A silenced partner. A carefully timed death. But they still lacked one thing: conclusive cause. The cremation had been stopped just in time. But the toxicology report hadn't yet arrived. And Matthew Vaughn? He was already planning a leave of absence from work. He told his supervisors he needed space to heal. What he didn't know was that the walls were closing in. July turned to August, and in the small town of Portbridge, the heat broke, but tension only tightened. In the state forensic lab in Salem, toxicologist Dr. Kevin Shaw stared at his report. It was conclusive. It was damning. And it was the first time Sierra Lanes finally had a voice again, through her blood. Her samples, drawn before death, stored for postmortem analysis, had arrived under the label possible poisoning/inconclusive syndrome. Blood, urine, tissue slides from her kidneys and liver. Dr. Shaw knew what to look for. He had read the original diagnosis, HLH. He didn't buy it. And he'd seen the symptoms: vomiting, diarrhea, fluid retention, multi-organ failure within 48 hours. Classic. Textbook. Colchicine. When the LCMS/MS analysis confirmed it, the concentration in Sierra's bloodstream was more than triple the median fatal dosage for someone of her body weight. She didn't ingest it by accident. She didn't mistake it for a supplement. And she didn't have gout. There was no medical reason for colchicine to be in her system. The team ran one more check. They tested for delivery vectors, what kind of liquid medium the substance was mixed with. Trace residues in her stomach lining showed blended berry pulp, almond lipids, and tannin compounds consistent with red wine. Just like she described in her final texts. Had a smoothie with wine. Tasted weird. Couldn't sleep. That drink wasn't reconciliation. It was execution. The findings reached the Portbridge Police Department on August 8, 2023. Chief Investigator Lillian Price reviewed the file and gave a single directive. Bring him in. Quietly. At 5:46 a.m. the next morning, a 3-unit team knocked on the door of the Lanes home. Matthew Vaughn answered in jogging clothes, holding a protein bar and earbuds. He didn't ask why they were there. He simply said, "Let me get my shoes." The interrogation room wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No slamming fists. Just a man in a gray hoodie, arms crossed, listening as Detective Price laid out a timeline. July 5th, Matthew searches colchicine dosage by weight. July 10th, he orders injectable colchicine using a professional email. July 15th, he calculates fatal dosage for a 119-pound person. July 19th, he makes a smoothie. July 22nd, Sierra dies. July 24th, he posts a tribute. July 26th, his girlfriend moves in. July 29th, he deposits $450,000. At the bottom of the folder was the toxicology report. Price slid it across the table. She never had a chance, Matthew. This wasn't HH. This wasn't natural. This was clinical, calculated poisoning. The kind only someone like you could pull off. Matthew didn't flinch. He leaned back, nodded slowly, and said, "You're making assumptions." Then silence. When they presented him with the pharmacy invoice from the colchicine order, bearing his billing info, IP address, and confirmation emails, he changed tactics. She ordered it. She must have used my credentials. And when they showed him the customer service log, where he contacted the pharmacy asking to delete the order from their system, he blinked. That was about a separate order. For hospital use. I didn't want it traced. Not like that. Detectives asked why he included no hospital name or authorization ID in the email. He had no answer. Later, police uncovered his personal laptop hidden behind a false wall panel in the home office. On it, a deleted folder was recovered, containing dosage calculators, a spreadsheet labeled Emergency Dose Profiles, a deleted memo titled Reasons It Could Be HLH, one unsent email draft with the subject line, Worst Case Equals Sympathy. That draft read, I know people will judge, but this grief will look real. I've practiced enough. Meanwhile, forensic techs tracked the full delivery path of the colchicine. It had been shipped from an overseas lab, through a middle agent in Nebraska, and finally to a P.O. box in Eugene, Oregon, registered under the name Vaughn Research Consulting. That P.O. box had been opened 2 weeks before Sierra died. But perhaps the final blow came from Matthew himself, caught on security footage returning the leftover vials. He wasn't hiding his face. He wasn't using gloves. He believed he was too smart to get caught. But science disagreed. On August 14th, Matthew Vaughn was officially charged with second-degree murder, with intent and premeditation. Bail was denied. But the story didn't end there. Because as prosecutors combed through his digital devices, they encountered a new challenge. One that could change everything. A legal battle over privacy. Matthew's defense team filed a motion, arguing that the warrant used to seize 14 devices, including work-related laptops, had been too broad. There was no specificity, the motion stated. Investigators accessed sensitive medical data unrelated to the crime. This is a violation of HIPAA and the Fourth Amendment. It was a bold strategy, but one that might work. Because when police first applied for the warrant, they hadn't yet confirmed the cause of death. They had suspicions, digital patterns, strange behaviors, but not proof. And the judge, concerned about professional overreach, agreed to hear the challenge. If successful, all digital evidence could be thrown out. All the search histories, all the dosage files, even the billing receipts. Without them, would the case survive? Would science alone be enough? It could have ended there. The toxicology was clear. The motive was obvious. The trail of digital fingerprints was unmistakable. But justice, especially in the American legal system, doesn't always arrive when science does. And for Sierra Lanes, even death wasn't the end of her silence. On September 11, 2023, the defense team for Matthew Vaughn stood before the Circuit Court of Marion County and made their case. The devices seized were not only improperly obtained, but they included work-issued equipment containing privileged healthcare data, making the entire seizure unconstitutional. The prosecutor pushed back. We weren't accessing patient data, she argued. We were confirming a murderer's plan. But the judge disagreed. Not on the murder, not on the motive, but on the method. He ruled that because the original warrant failed to specify categories, such as toxicology searches, financial activity, or communications related to the victim, the seizure was too broad under Oregon state law. And with that ruling, everything obtained from the 14 devices, the search history, the order confirmation, the deleted draft titled, Worst Case Equals Sympathy, was rendered inadmissible in court. The case would now have to stand on physical and testimonial evidence alone. For Sierra's family, it felt like grief was being tried a second time. He didn't just take her life, Elena said to local reporters. He tried to take her story too. They had lost her once. Now they risked losing the truth. Still, the prosecution pressed forward. The confirmed presence of lethal colchicine in Sierra's blood. No medical history or prescription tying her to that drug. A smoothie glass with traces of tannins and berry pulp, consistent with delivery of the poison. The cremation request filed within hours of her death. The insurance payout of $450,000, deposited days later. And most disturbingly, the appearance of Kendra Ross, in Sierra's robe, in Sierra's home, laughing in the kitchen before Sierra's body was even cold. It was enough to proceed. But would it be enough to convict? The trial began on March 4, 2024. The courtroom was small. No cameras were allowed. But every seat was filled. Prosecutors opened with a timeline. A tight one. July 19th. He blended it. July 20th. She collapsed. July 22nd. She died. July 24th. He kissed another woman. They called Nina Chapman to the stand. She wept as she recalled the taste of the smoothie. The moment Sierra joked, "Maybe he's trying to poison me." The chill she felt later, when that memory turned real. They called Dr. Kevin Shaw, who explained the precision of the toxicology. They played the 911 call. She said she had a smoothie, then wine. Then she got sick. His voice on the recording was cold, controlled, almost prepared. But the defense? They had only one job. And they did it well. They leaned hard into the absence of digital evidence. Where is the order form? Where is the email? Where is the search history? They claimed Sierra may have had mental health struggles. They hinted that she could have researched the drug herself. They even insinuated that her relationship with Adrian James, her confidant, was more than just emotional. That perhaps she had been planning to fake illness, frame her husband, and run away with someone else. It was cruel. It was implausible. But it was just enough to plant doubt. The jury deliberated for 9 days. On March 27, 2024, they returned with a verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree. There was no applause. No gasp. Just silence. Not the kind that follows fear. The kind that comes after a storm, when everything is broken, but finally still. Matthew Vaughn was sentenced to 45 years to life in Oregon State Penitentiary. He showed no emotion. Neither did Kendra Ross, seated in the back row, wearing sunglasses indoors. Sierra's parents declined interviews. Elena only released a single statement. This was never about punishment. This was about not letting him write her ending. Sierra loved deeply. She worked honestly. She died quietly. And now, she will be remembered loudly. In Portbridge, the house on Forest Glen Lane went up for sale. The listing didn't mention what had happened. But one neighbor planted a tree in the front yard anyway. A young cherry blossom. Every spring, it blooms briefly, soft, brilliant, and impossibly quiet. Just like Sierra. Thank you for following this case. Sometimes, justice is not about the evidence we can show, but the truth we refuse to bury.